The gentleman from Fairfax, Mr. Keam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaking to the amendment.
The gentleman has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen of the House. Yesterday, when I was listening to this debate, or at least presentation from the gentlewoman from Fairfax, I was somewhat surprised because I didn't realize that this issue was so controversial. As the body remembers, when it first came through, we voted on this, I think, 96-4, and it went to the other body, and the other body passed it by 39-1 with a substitute. And I've looked at both substitute and the original language, and I agree with the gentleman from Delegate Orak that there are some changes, but the fundamental goal and the purpose behind it, the policy goal, which is what we ought to be concerned with, is, I think, identical, both the original and the substitute. But I do prefer the substitute a little bit more than the original because the substitute, number one, was drafted in a way where the language is clear and the intent is clear. But secondly, to the point that Delegate Orak just mentioned, the unlawful detention refers to the unlawful detention in the federal law itself, and not in us trying to interpret it as an unlawful or not. So I think that's not necessarily a big concern. But if I could maybe just take a couple minutes and share a little perspective on this, because I respect the gentleman lady from Fairfax and her role, 9/11 and beyond that. I know that she served in the federal government at the time and did a lot of very important work that we ought to thank her for, and the administration at that time for protecting us from anything that happened right after 9/11. But like all of you in this room, everybody in America, we all remember what happened on 9/11 that morning. I was actually sitting in the U.S. Capitol that day as well. And when the second plane hit, we knew right away that this wasn't an accident and that there was something behind this. And we also, as Congressional Hill staffers, recognize that perhaps if there are other attacks, other planes, that the U.S. Capitol may be a target as well. And as a result, we all ran out of there as quickly as possible. Before even the Capitol Police told us to evacuate, all of us were starting to walk out of there, make sure the visitors were safe. And as we left there, and all the turmoil that happened after that, and seeing the smoke coming up from the Pentagon, we knew that the world had changed. The next time I was in the Capitol building was a day or two after that incident when we were finally allowed to come back in. And I was called into a meeting where we had the majority leaders and minority leaders of the Senate and the House, as well as chairman and the ranking members of the Senate and the House Judiciary Committees. And a gentleman from the administration, Bush administration, came over, Attorney General John Ashcroft, for whom a gentlewoman from Fairfax worked with. And the Attorney General Ashcroft brought his deputy, a gentleman named Viet Dinh, who is known as the author of the Patriot Act. And at that meeting where I was with my, at the time, my boss, the Attorney General's office brought boxes and boxes of files and asked us to take a look at it. They were hundreds of pages long. It was the anti-terrorism bill that the Bush administration asked us, the Congress at that time, to adopt in order to fight back terrorism. And as the gentlewoman correctly pointed out, this wasn't a criminal incident. This was a terrorist. This was the first time in the history of our nation that we had to fight an enemy that we couldn't define and we didn't understand. And so that bill eventually became the USA Patriot Act, which passed fairly unanimously, although later on there were some controversies. About a week after 9/11, I believe it was September 18th, Congress also passed the authorization to use military force. AUMF is what it's called. And that was also debated heavily in Congress. It provided the president whatever authority he needed to go after the evildoers, the ones that perpetrated the crimes of 9/11 and the terrorism, and to make sure that we bring them to justice. And I believe it passed pretty unanimously, or at least with significant support from both sides of the aisle. But the problem is, in the 10 years since 9/11, and 10 years since the Patriot Act and AUMF went into effect, we've now found that the laws in this world, when we're fighting a global war on terrorism, is sometimes inadequate. The language that we use to codify our laws, our law enforcement, our criminal intent, our investigations sometimes don't necessarily meet the situations that we face on the battlegrounds. And so what we found is every time the administration, both the Republican and Democratic administrations and the presidential administration, when they try to push the envelope to go after the bad guys, to go after the evildoers, to go after the conspiracy and to make sure that we're bringing these guys to justice, we find that sometimes the courts rein them back, saying that that violates the Constitution. It violates certain provisions within our Constitution that requires certain processes to be followed. And even if it's in the context of the military and not in the criminal civilian courts, that even in the military commissions, there are restrictions on how far the government can go in going after terrorists. And so we found in the Hamdi decision, in the Hamdan decision, and many other court cases that have come out since then, in the decade of us trying to balance as lawmakers, to balance the right between going after the bad guys and providing all the law enforcement tools that government needs, and at the same time protecting our civil liberties as Americans, we found that that balance is not a clear line. It's not a black and white line. A lot of gray matter in between. And the courts, the executive branch, Congress, and yes, even the state legislatures are grappling with this because this is a fight that all of us have to engage together. So in this context, ladies and gentlemen of the House, I believe this language is necessary. And I support the delegate from Prince William, because even though I've generally not supported the idea that we as the state legislatures memorialize Congress to what to do, what not to do, or debate what's happening in Congress, and I really don't prefer to do that, I think this is a situation where we as Virginians, we as Virginia lawmakers are deciding what our role should be in the war on terrorism. And for us to be able to draw that line between strong law enforcement, all the legitimate tools that we need to give law enforcement, FBI, military, everybody else that needs to be out there fighting, and at the same time protecting our innocent Virginians from any kind of government overbearing. And so this law, basically, I can interpret it in two ways. One is, if it's in fact codified in current law, which some are arguing in Congress, that this is part of AUMF, that Section 1021 of NDNA, which is the National Defense Authorization Act, if that section is already the law, and if the President already has that authority, then this is just belt and suspenders. We're just saying we don't want any of our military, our National Guard, our agencies, our law enforcement to be engaged in unlawful detention of American citizens who should not be detained anyway. So if you want to interpret it that way, it's harmless. And I think the Senate language is fine to have. On the other hand, if it turns out, as President Obama signed, when he signed NDA into law, he strictly said that I don't need this enforcement. Congress is asking me to do this when I don't need it. I'm going to not enforce this for my administration, and for future administrations they can change their minds. But if Congress and this administration decided that this law is inadequate for whatever reason, and for whatever circumstances we may not be able to encounter now, but in that gray area between fighting terrorism and protecting civil liberties, if somehow the government oversteps its bound, somehow we end up violating people's civil liberties, at that point, I want to make sure Virginia is on the right side of history. Because about 70 years ago, a president, just like the current president, elected into office to protect our people and to do everything they can to protect our Constitution, still made a grave error. Executive Order 9066 was signed by President Franklin Roosevelt February 19th of 1942, in the heat of the World War II, just a couple of months after the fatal day when Pearl Harbor was attacked. And that president, in his own way, thinking that he was going to protect Americans against evil terrorists and all the people that are coming to attack us, in his own way thought the best thing he can do is protect certain people, certain Americans. And yet what he did was he looked at the enemy, realized that they looked a certain way, they came from a certain part of the world, and decided to round up everybody that looked the same in this country, even if you're born and raised here. And so 110,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry were rounded up all around the country, put away into camps. And the government's line was that we are protecting these Americans in case other people attack them because they may look like the enemy. Well, if they're protecting Americans, why were the guns in the camps pointing inward and not outward? They were not protecting them. They were detaining them. And if the war had gone on longer than 4 years, they might have been detained indefinitely. That led to Congress in 1989 apologizing for the first time in history, Congress writing the words that said, "We, the nation, apologizes to Americans for what we've done wrong." I'm not saying that we will ever do that again. I certainly hope not. I pray we don't. But in this war on terrorism, and as we go in this uncharted territory, we don't know what's going to happen next. We don't know what kind of enemy is going to attack us. And we don't know what kind of Americans who may not look the same as some of us in this room may be targeted. And we don't ever want to be in a situation where American citizens and their civil liberties are being violated because of some language in the Constitution that's misinterpreted by this Congress or this President. So this, by passing the Senate amendment and supporting the gentleman from Prince William, we are putting Virginia on the right side of history. So I urge passage of the Senate amendment.